Let's continue with the last intervention. Well, it's the last, but not the least. We have Professor Karina Nielsen, who is Chair of Work Psychology and Director of the Institute of Work Psychology in Sheffield. She is a research affiliate of Karolinska Institute in Sweden as well, and in Connecticut also in a Center for Promotion of Health, so really diverse in terms of location. She is specialized in intervention and is probably one of the main authors nowadays in our domain in this topic. Everybody is asking to Karina about how to make an intervention. So today, she's going to be talking about this. She published a lot of papers about this issue and other related topics in top journals as well. And she's associate editor of Work Stress and is serving as well in other editorial boards. So today she's going to give a lecture about from what works to what works for whom in which circumstances, evaluating organizational intervention. So welcome, Professor Nielsen. Welcome, Karina.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Alfredo, and thank you very much to both Mirko and Alfredo for inviting me. I can hear myself. Can you hear myself twice? Or can you hear me once? That's fine, then I'll just have to get used to listening to myself. So we have heard over the last couple of days a lot about relationships and how we might improve employee health and well-being. But I am here to say before you start doing your interventions on how to improve health and well-being, you need to think about how do we design, implement and evaluate our interventions. But first, a little lesson about England. How many people have been to Sheffield? Yeah, well, the usual suspects. How many people know where Sheffield is? Exactly. So it looks like it's in the middle, but of course if you take Scotland away, it's in the northern part of the UK. Sheffield is also known as Steel City. It is very famous for the steel industry a few years back, and as you might know, Margaret Thatcher put an end to the strong steel history. A lot of the mining industry has closed down. So what are we famous for now? Beer. Ale. The Grim North has turned into one of the most famous places in the UK if you are after craft beer. Ironically, I used to live in Norwich before I moved to Sheffield, and they fight over who produces the best beer in the UK. And the most ironic thing is that I don't drink beer at all. So what I did in Norwich and what I'm doing in Sheffield, not quite sure. And now you might be asking yourself, so as you might be able to guess, Steel City, proud worker history. So now you ask yourself, why does she have an elephant here? That's all part of the history of Sheffield. What you see here is not just any elephant, it is Lizzie. And Lizzie is famous in Sheffield because during the First World War, what happened? They had to send the horses to the front. And what do you do when you have a lot of heavy steel to carry around in city? You get a circus elephant, of course. So they got Lizzie. And Lizzie was well liked amongst the citizens of Sheffield, perhaps less so by the wives, the housewives of Sheffield, because she had a sweet tooth. So she was known to nick the odd pie if it was cooling in the window. But nevertheless, she is now an icon for Sheffield, as are the two ladies up here, because during the Second World War, there was a lack of labor in the steel factories. So the women went into the factories and worked with the steel. So we are also known, us that live in Sheffield and are of the female gender, to be women of steel. And with that little history lesson, I will move on to what am I actually going to talk about, if not Sheffield. So first of all, I want to define what am I talking about when I talk about organizational interventions? What is my definition? And then I want to talk about why I think the gold standard, that is often being used to evaluate organizational interventions. The randomized controlled trial is not good enough in my view. Why I think that realist evaluation might be a good alternative, and provide some examples of how we can use realist evaluation, how it has been used. And then I'll discuss the implications for research and practice, and then, of course, finish with a few conclusions. So, when I talk about organizational interventions, what do I mean? Well, these are interventions that focus on improving the psychosocial work environment and the health and well-being of organizational members, and that can be just about anybody within the organization. So it can be employees, it can be line managers, senior managers. And it's quite different from individual level interventions, for example, training, in that we focus on the psychosocial work environment. We focus on changing the way work is organized, designed, and managed, so we try to change work practices and procedures. Norbert Semmer conducted a review in 2011 where he identified 4 focus areas for changing work practice and procedures. We can focus on changing the tasks of the job. Do we do the tasks that we have differently? Changing the work context, so trying to change, reduce, most often probably, not increase workloads, and working time. So for example, if you are a nurse, is it better for you to be working 3 days and having 3 days off? Or would it be working 6 days and having 6 days off? We can try to experiment with the kind of working times and working schedules of people. Then we can also try to increase role clarity or reduce role conflict. So what is actually expected of me in my job, and do people agree on what is expected of me in my job? We can also try to improve social relationships, both horizontally and vertically. So we can try to improve relationships between managers, line managers and employees. Rolf would probably agree with me that's a good idea. Yeah? And also we can try to improve the social support and team reflexivity, team climate amongst employees. And I think I might have a friend over here. But more often than not, it's a mixture. So it's not that you go in and you change social support between or from managers. If you increase social support, you might also increase role clarity. So all these things are interrelated. What is important to note here is that participation is a key element. So it's not that we as researchers come in and say, now we will improve social support. No, we go in, we ask employees, and we help them identify what are the problems they are experiencing. So they identify what are the problems, line managers and employees together, and also what can we do about it. It is generally recommended because these type of interventions tackles the problems at source rather than treating the symptoms. So rather than looking at treating burnout, we are looking at the things that lead to burnout. What I have done together with an Australian colleague is that we have reviewed the policy level information. So what are the recommended processes and methods for conducting organizational interventions in a lot of European countries? Spain is included in that, the UK, Ireland, Germany, and Canada. They're not quite European, but they have a standard, so we used it and looked at that as well. And we basically looked at, so what do these methods have in common? And what we could identify was 5 phases. You'll probably recognize it. You can't read the writing, I'm sure, but it's a problem-solving cycle. So you start out with initiation or preparation. How do we set up our intervention? We establish steering groups with employees and manager representatives. We develop a plan for communication. How are we going to tell people about this intervention and what goes on within the intervention and how it progresses? We also look to build capacity. So when I say we make changes to the way work is organized, designed, and managed, I don't necessarily mean that that's all we focus on. We might want to go in and train line managers on how to run a process like this. And we test whether people are ready for change. Do they think this intervention is a good idea even? Then in the next stage, or phase, we go in and we screen. We go in and we explore what are the problems that workers and managers are experiencing, and we feed back the results to employees. In the third phase, we develop action plans. So what is the content of this intervention? It's not predefined up front. It's something that managers and employees decide themselves. What are we going to do to improve the psychosocial work environment in this place? Most often this is done in action planning workshops. And then the idea is that you develop detailed action plans. In the fourth phase, surprise, surprise, you implement your action plans. And once you have implemented your action plans, you evaluate whether these action plans had the intended effect. There are three principles we found across the different methods. Woohoo! I didn't even touch it. So one is obviously participation. Another one is management support. So senior management and line managers have to support the intervention in order for it to work. And finally, this is a test, do I remember the key principles? And I do, because the last one is intervention fit. So when we develop our interventions, we can't just develop a taken off the shelf intervention. We need to take into consideration what kind of people are we working with here, what is the existing organizational culture. So what is my problem with a randomized controlled trial? How many are familiar with a randomized controlled trial? Not everybody, so I'll just go through it. So the idea is that if you have 50 Mirkos and you have 50 Karinas, and you put us all in our names in a hat and you draw lots, there's a reasonable likelihood that we will end up pretty equally in two different groups. You can then, I think the upper group, that's the intervention group. So we do something to one of the groups, and the second group we don't do anything to. That's business as usual, or care as usual, as they call it in medicine, where we borrowed this design from. What we do in the intervention group is that we implement our intervention. In the other group we do nothing, and then afterwards we come back and we measure. So we measure, has there been any improvement in health and well-being, for example, if that's our outcome, and then we compare, is there an improvement in the intervention group, and is there an improvement over and above any changes that we see in the control group. And then we conclude that's due to our intervention. Where's the evidence? Because we don't know what's going on. And if you think about what I just said, that it's a problem-solving cycle approach, there's a lot going on there. It's not that we give Mirko a pill at 3 o'clock every day and take your pill and everybody, it's going to help. It's so complex, there's so many things going on that we don't actually know what's going on in the black box. Another issue is, of course, blinding. So Mirko might not know whether he gets the placebo pill or he gets the real pill. I'm the nurse giving him the pill. I don't know what the pill is, whether he gets the placebo or whether he gets the treatment pill. And it's actually, sometimes I think we're doing the medical world a disfavor by saying that this is what they do, because they don't do that anymore themselves. They actually also have started looking at whether Mirko takes the pill. I was teaching PhD students once, and I was blah, 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 talking about the medical trials and stuff, and this senior manager, nurse, raised her hand and said, you know, it doesn't work like that in the medical world either. So she had been a treatment nurse, she had been given pills to Mirko, and Mirko had come in and he had said, you have changed the pill. And the nurse said, how do you know? Because when I flush the pill down the toilet, it floats. So Mirko is clearly very naughty also in medical trials and doesn't necessarily take the pill. So what are the problems in organizational intervention specifically? Well, first of all, it's participation. It's about behavior change. So we decide together what the intervention is going to look like and what the content of the intervention is going to look like. And that can be in a million different ways in a million different organizations. We also have the problem of cluster randomization, because in organizations you don't randomize at the individual level. Because if Mirko, Alfredo and I, we work in the same department, you try to change my social support, that's going to influence their social support as well. They might have to support me in a different way. So we will randomize at the departmental, the group level. There are also all kinds of other things going on at the same time. We might get a new manager that we really like or we really dislike, and this manager might not think that this intervention is a good idea, so they might not support it. We are also a very diverse group of employees. So Alfredo might like some better social support, whereas Mirko, he doesn't really care. He thinks it's absolutely fine the way it is. So we need to identify what are the problems that we have in common. It's not predefined up front. Like, for example, when you run a diabetes trial, we only pick the people that suffer from diabetes. There's no easy implementation strategy. So if we say that there's no one treatment or pill, so how we might want to implement social support differs. So for example, amongst postal service workers, you might increase social support by giving them a mobile phone so they can call each other. But as academics, it's not going to help us much to get a mobile phone. We have one already, and we might not want to sit and call each other. What we might need is help structures in place to help us write papers or grant applications. And even that can be done in many different ways. We can go on a writing retreat. We can have more experienced people reading your papers, commenting on them. So there's no easy way, there's no formulated way of improving social support and implementing it. There are also many different stakeholders. So HR might not think, human resources might not think that our intervention is a good idea because they're doing something similar and they think theirs is so much better than ours, so they might work against it. Or it might be the line managers see this as a threat to their power. Why do employees have to be involved in how we, what kind of work practices and procedures we have here? So they don't think it's a good idea. And also control groups can be a challenge. So if I go into, now we imagine that Alfredo and Mirko have got each their department, and I come in and say, I have got this fantastic intervention. It will improve well-being, it'll make people more engaged. Mirko gets the intervention. What does Alfredo say? Exactly. Well, you're going to say, you might have a stronger opinion and say, well, actually, Karina, this is no good because you have said that my employees need the intervention as well. Why can't I have it? I want it too. So you might not be so happy. The Spanish, who cares? Might not apply everywhere. And also you can argue, who am I as a researcher to go in and identify what organizations need help and then withhold the active ingredients from them. So I say, okay, Alfredo, I know your department has a problem, but I think my design is more important, so your employees can continue to suffer. It's unethical, isn't it? Or you can argue it's unethical. So two of the most common validities are external validity, generalizability. So can we transfer one intervention to another setting? And I have a fantastic study from some former colleagues in Denmark who implemented exactly the same intervention in 3 different organizations. This was in the elder care, and they introduced an IT system for planning the rota. So you could put in your wishes in the IT system, and simsalabim, it will come up with a working schedule for you. Genius, isn't it? That's bound to work. But 3 different organizations, 3 different outcomes. In organization A, it didn't work. It didn't improve work-life balance, and it didn't improve well-being. Now, why would that be? That was because downsizing, they were laying off people, meant that they said, we can't really have this system. It doesn't work in these circumstances, so they cancelled using the system. So they didn't use it. And guess what? If you don't use the system, it doesn't lead to any improvements. In organization B, the picture was completely different. They liked the IT system, and it supported what they were used to doing, so they thought this is actually a tool that enables us to do what we want to do and what we have been doing. It just makes it easier for us. And guess what? It improved employee well-being and work-life balance. In the third organization, management said, yeah, we like the system, but we don't like to give away all the power here. So we have a buffer zone. So it might be that Mirko should be starting at 9 o'clock according to the IT system, but I make the decision that I can still call in Mirko an hour earlier, which of course has implications for him dropping off the kids on time. So guess what? It didn't work because the system was not implemented according to plan. And it didn't improve work-life balance, and it didn't improve well-being. So we see here that the same intervention has completely different outcomes in 3 different organizations because it was implemented in different contexts. If we look at internal validity, the extent to which we can make a link between the cause and the effect, that's difficult in these type of interventions because we don't necessarily know what the intervention is. It's not predetermined. It's something that we develop over time. And some of the things that we have found is that line managers can make or break an intervention. They might think it's a good idea. They might not think it's a good idea. I have summarized this literature in a book chapter in 2017, where I basically give a lot of examples of why line managers sometimes make or break an intervention and how they do it. And again, participation, that determines intervention outcomes. I'll come back to that later. So we don't actually know whether it's the content of the intervention that has an effect or whether it's actually the process that may lead to the intervention not having the intended effect or perhaps having the intended effects. And what is really important here, that the intervention is nothing. There is no such thing as an objective intervention. An intervention is simply something that gives people an opportunity to do things in a different way, or not to do things in a different way and do what they've always done. But the intervention opens the doors for people reflecting differently and acting differently. So, this is where realist evaluation comes into the picture. How many are familiar with the realist evaluation? A couple? Yeah? So, the basic tenet of realist evaluation is to explore what works for whom in which circumstances and why it works. And they basically talk about CMO configurations. So what you need to do is to understand what are the contextual factors that might make your intervention work or might hinder your intervention. So you need to understand what are the conditions within each organization and perhaps also the national contexts that are needed in order for change to be brought about. Then you need to understand what are the mechanisms that can be triggered in different contexts. So what is it actually that makes our intervention work? And then you need to test whether these mechanisms actually bring about our intended outcomes. For us, it's typically health and well-being. So you talk about context plus mechanisms, maybe one or more, will lead to intended outcomes. And now you think, what on earth is she talking about? What does she mean by context? What does she mean by mechanisms? What does she mean by outcomes? That's exactly what I'll be talking about now. You think. So basically, what are mechanisms? The key characteristics of mechanisms are that they are the reasoning and behaviors of participants. So it's actually what do people do within the intervention. They may change over time, over the duration during the 5 phases. They are there, they exist, even if they're not triggered in this particular intervention. And they interact with each other. So one mechanism might influence another, and they might be linked in negative or positive feedback loops, and one mechanism might inform the next. I'll give you examples of that. Mechanisms can occur at different levels. So at the individual level, a mechanism might be self-efficacy. So I need to feel that I can do something with this intervention in order for it to work. Another mechanism might be job crafting at the individual level. So me being told, now you can shape the job the way you want it to, might encourage me to job craft, and then that influences, that's the explanation why we see the intended outcomes of the intervention. At the group level, we might have social capital. So we build social capital because we engage in participatory processes, and that is what explains that we actually find something, a good outcome, any improvements in employee health and well-being. Or team reflexivity, because if we are to develop action plans, we might as a team have to be able to sit down and reflect on what are the working practices, procedures we have now, and how might they improve in order for the intervention to work. It can also be at the organizational level, so the management behaviors, them actually allocating resources to the intervention might be important. Good. So, I have to say, realist evaluation is something I've stolen from the public health arena. And I thought, well, what's out there? Is there anybody in the organizational domain that has used CMO configurations and realist evaluation? And I did a literature review, and I was bitterly disappointed. But I did manage to find 2 studies. Neither of them actually tested CMO configurations, but they identified what are the organizational mechanisms that might facilitate return to work. So if people are on sick leave, what might help them return to work rather than being laid off or getting disability pension. And what we could see was that they identified that line managers' communication with employees while they are on sick leave, so that you actually have a line manager who talks to people while they're on sick leave, that might increase return to work. That line managers have regular contact with the employees at an early stage. So rather than waiting months and months and months, you contact people a week after they've gone on sick leave. That might be a good mechanism to help people return to work so they feel valued. Another mechanism might be that senior managers provide clear guidance on how to manage employees. So this is a mechanism that influences the line managers. So the senior managers need to provide guidance to the line managers. So how do you actually do this? Because this is not necessarily something they know how to do. So senior managers need to provide guidelines, one mechanism, which will then influence the next mechanism, line managers communicating and having regular contact immediately after sick leave. Another study looked at lean implementation in healthcare. How many of you are familiar with lean? Lean is a continuous improvement process, so how can we streamline work processes so it becomes more efficient? And the mechanisms they identified in this study were, well, if you allocate resources to lean activities, so working with lean, that will result in employee participation. If you have a common set of lean tools, that will ensure that there is a continuous, ongoing improvement process, so people actually try to improve the work practices and procedures. And that should generate improved decision making that will lead to better quality of care. Again, this was in the healthcare. They also suggested that an important mechanism might be line managers that promote the use of lean tools. So in the teams, please use these tools. That will increase participation in the improvement processes. Increased level of staff and patient participation will help quality of care and work with the continuous improvement processes. And a common set of lean tools will ensure a consistent improvement process. So if everybody uses the same tools, it's likely to work. And again, visibility of line managers. If it's visible that they are responsible for driving this process, it'll be transparent who's responsible, and it will also lead to accountability, because if it's obvious to everybody that Mirko has to do it, I will be looking at him and I will be observing whether Mirko is doing it. So what's the problem with this? What they did was that they interviewed people and then they developed these potential mechanisms. What's the problem? They didn't actually measure whether these mechanisms existed or led to the intended outcome. So there's a danger zone here. We haven't actually tested whether these suggested mechanisms are related to the outcomes. We don't know whether they were triggered or whether they actually worked, whether they were the correct mechanisms to ensure better quality of care in the healthcare or sustainable return to work amongst employees. So what I did instead was that I looked in our traditional work psychology literature, and I identified 2 studies that didn't use realist evaluation. But if you look at the way what they've done, it could kind of be translated in to CMO configurations, or maybe at least MO configurations where the mechanisms lead to outcomes. So in the first study by David Holman and Caroline Axtell, what they looked at content mechanisms. So they looked at the content of the action plans. And they developed 2 action plans. They developed an action plan that employees, not line managers, should complete administrative tasks and deal with minor customer queries. And that would result in employees taking responsibility. They would take control over their own work tasks, and that should lead to well-being. That was one mechanism, so the mechanism here is job control. They also had another action plan that said that, well, it's important to outline what are the performance criteria in this organization, and we should hold regular team briefings that will increase feedback, and again, that should improve employee well-being. Then we have Frank Bond, who suggested that job control might be a process mechanism. It's a mechanism of the intervention process. So what he said, that if you are engaging in a participatory process where line managers and employees discuss together how are we going to change the way work is organized, designed, and managed, that will lead to people taking responsibility for improving their own work. And guess what? That would lead to job control. And guess what? In both studies, they found that increased job control, the mechanism being triggered, led to employee well-being. But what's the challenge here? Job control, we don't actually know whether that is due to the participatory process or the content of the action plans. So again, there's a danger here because they didn't actually measure the action plans. They didn't actually measure the participatory process. So they just said, this is what we think it is, but they haven't actually measured it. Now we move on to context. And context is defined as the conditions that interventions find themselves in. So it's the organizational context, to some extent also the national or the international context. We talk about 2 different types of context. We talk about the discrete context. So these are the events that happen throughout the intervention. It might be new line managers coming in, it might be senior managers coming in, it might be downsizing, it might be mergers. So all these separate events that might influence our intervention process. It's also the omnibus context. So it is what are the cultural issues, what is the level that we are at here. And we talk about context at 4 levels. So we talk about the individual. So what are the values, the roles, and the knowledge of people within the organization? What is the interpersonal context we are talking about? How do people communicate together? How do they work together? What kind of networks do they have? So if you go into an organization and they spend their time fighting, managers and employees can't talk to each other, neither can employees. The likelihood of you being able to run a participatory process is not that great. There's the institutional level. So what are the informal rules, the organizational culture? What is the leadership? What are the regulations? They are likely to influence the mechanisms being triggered or not. And then finally, at the infrastructural level, the political support within the organization. So if we go back to our studies in the return to work and the healthcare, they mentioned, again, identified a lot of context issues. So for example, they suggested that an organizational climate where senior managers have good relations with line managers, then it's likely that the line managers are going to do what they're expected to do. Where communication between line managers and employees is respectful, then it's likely that the mechanism of communication is going to happen once the employee is on sick leave. Because the problem is, of course, that if I am Mirko's line manager and I'm the reason why he went on sick leave, it might not work particularly well that I call him and say, "Hello, Mirko, how are you doing?" So it's important that we have a good relationship before Mirko goes off sick. But I also need to have adequate training. I need to know what I'm doing. So I don't call Mirko and say, "So when are you coming back to work?" You're just making it up. I need to know how I communicate in a good way with Mirko. And financial pressures might motivate me to facilitate that Mirko comes back. If I can easily get another employee and not spend much time on training him, I might not care so much about getting Mirko back to work. Sorry about that, Mirko. In the healthcare lean project, they mostly talked about hindering factors in the context. So they talked about if lean is poorly integrated with other initiatives within the organization, it's likely not to work. If line managers that are responsible for implementing lean, they feel poorly supported, they're probably not going to work hard towards implementing lean. Some of the problem they found was that central authorities did not support the adjustment to the local context. So if we have a one-size-fits-all, it might not work. If we don't have good measurement data in place to give us information about how we implement continuous improvement processes, then it's likely not to be implemented. And if line managers fear that I can't actually experiment trying to implement lean without me being punished, then it's like they're not going to try to implement it. If we look at the two studies of the context in the Holman and Axel case, they didn't mention context at all. In the Frank Bond study, they found that if people are high in psychological flexibility, so they are open to new experience and trying new things, then it's likely to trigger the mechanism of job control and in return employee health and well-being. So that's one way of looking at it. And then I thought, what about my own studies? I did a mixed method study in 2006 where I went back and looked at it with fresh eyes, and I realized actually I studied context mechanism without even knowing it. So the study was in 4 industrial canteens. There were 2 control groups and 2 intervention groups. What they did was that they had occupational health consultants develop interventions. They developed interventions in 4 different categories. So improving individual health, smoking cessation, weight loss, team building activities, how can we work better together, psychosocial work activities, so for example, changing the task of the job, and the physical work environment. And then a research team came in and evaluated how did the intervention work. We did a lot of things. We had questionnaires before and after. We had the reports from consultants telling us what they had done. There were workplace observations, so went into the workplace and saw what was actually going on. And there were interviews with individual employees, but also group interviews. And the idea was that the consultants had this kind of toolbox with lots of different activities, and then each intervention group could then pick what are the best activities for us in this place. And it's a very small sample, so some things are significant and some things are not so significant, but you can see a clear pattern across personal development, job satisfaction, social support, that we found positive effects in 1 intervention group and 1 comparison group. Now that's not according to plan, is it? But it's consistent across these 3 outcomes. And if we add to this cognitive stress and vitality, we found the same effects. So 5 different outcomes, all showing the same pattern. All we can conclude from the body mass index is that in comparison group D, they had a lot of cake because that increased significantly. It didn't increase significantly, but it was quite higher than everywhere else. So the question is, of course, why do we find this? Why do we not find improvements in the 2 intervention groups? That's no good. But what we did was that we went in and we saw, okay, so did they actually implement what we are trying to achieve? Did they implement all the activities? And we can see a quite clear pattern here, is that in Canteen B, where we saw improvements, they implemented pretty much all the activities across the 4 types of activity, whereas in Canteen A, where we didn't find anything nice, they didn't really implement anything. So that kind of makes sense. If you don't implement, you don't get. Then we looked at the intervention groups and we kind of tried to find out, so what was actually going on? So we could see that there had been a lot of reorganization prior to the intervention starting. So they had merged with other canteens and the employees were a bit like, not another intervention. No, no more change. Just leave us alone. So they weren't really motivated. But because they had so many changes beforehand, it also meant that they had a highly developed culture. So there was a limited scope for development. They also made some more rather unpopular changes during the project. This is many years ago. And they implemented a no smoking policy. That didn't go down well. They also had conflicts at the same time as the intervention going on that the intervention didn't really manage to resolve. And then they didn't really like the consultant. The consultant was very much along the lines of, what do you think? What do you want to do? And these were canteen workers. They were just, can't you just tell us what to do? And again, as we saw on the previous slide, not that many activities were implemented. So that kind of gives an idea of why it didn't really work so well. In Canteen B, there were also changes during the project. There was a new manager coming in with a lot of energy saying, oh, this is perfect, can support what I want to achieve with this new group of employees. There was also increased time pressure, but they said it's okay that we have to work harder, that we have to be engaged in these ad hoc working groups, developing the intervention, because actually we can see we're gaining something from the intervention. They had a directive consultant telling them what to do, and they liked it, and they implemented a lot of activities. So, then we look at what happened in the comparison groups. So in Canteen C, where nothing really happened, there was downsizing and a lot of people left, and it meant that they couldn't fulfill the vacant positions, so they were actually short-staffed. So you can see why things didn't go particularly well there. And we're quite happy it didn't go particularly well, because we didn't want it to go well, because they're a control group. That's unethical to say, of course. But what happened in Canteen D, our comparison group, where things did go well? Well, what happened was that there was a new manager. And guess where that new manager came from? The intervention group. And she was a bit like, wait a minute, I was in the intervention group getting something nice. And now I'm in the control group not getting anything. Well, you know what? I'm just going to buy the services from the same occupational health consultancy service. Ha, ha, ha. So she bought the same activities. And guess what? We can now start to understand why it worked. What she also did a lot of other good things. This was a workplace that had some problems before the intervention, but what she did was that she managed to bring employees together. So they reinstated the Health and Safety Committee, and they introduced a lot of activities to support a good climate within the canteen. They also got more staffing, and there was very little turnover. So we can kind of start to understand why did it actually go well in a control group. So the key points I'm trying to get across here is that context matters. So the discrete context matters, downsizing, new managers matter, but also the omnibus context matters. So culture and organizational maturity, where are you? Do you have a limited scope for development, or is there good room for development? Are people ready for change? In terms of mechanisms, we could see that the process was important, whether consultants were directive or participatory, but also the mechanism of context. So actually, the exposure to the intervention activities, did they work? Another example was that we implemented teamwork in the elder care, trying to improve job satisfaction, well-being and reduce turnover. And basically what it was is that larger group of employees would be responsible for a smaller group of patients. And now we get to finally to the Cmo configuration testing. And I'm not going to go through all the different lines, because there are a lot of them. But what the take-home messages really are here, that we've got two types of mechanisms. We've got the content, actually, is teamwork being implemented? And we've got the process, do people feel, now we are measuring that they are involved in the intervention process, they are involved in developing and implementing interventions. And we can see when that happens, we do find different positive outcomes. What is also important is that we measured the context before the intervention. So the level of well-being, autonomy, social support, and job satisfaction that helped trigger either participation or actual changes in procedures, or both, of how we can use tools. But what I'm going to use as an example, is to see that we had an intervention also where we looked at lean implementation. This was with the Postal Service, and they already had Kaizen boards in place. Are you familiar with Kaizen boards? So plan, do, check, act. They already had that in place. So we thought, well, when we are implementing our action plans in our intervention, maybe we can just use those, and that might work. So rather than us coming up with new procedures for how they should implement their action plans, they can follow the PDCA way of working. And we tested this in a multi-level model. So we said the mechanism here is actually the use of a tool. We saw the Kaizen boards as a concrete tool, and we saw that this actually helped them report afterwards that they thought they'd become better at managing the psychosocial work environment, and that was then related to job satisfaction and mental health. In terms of context, we saw that existing levels of job satisfaction and mental health was also associated with them actually using the tools. So we tested a context mechanism, an outcome configuration. So what I'm really trying to get across here is that when you design, implement, and evaluate your interventions, you need to develop models for what am I actually looking at in each of the different phases, and how does one phase lead to the next phase. So what am I really trying to say is that when you develop your interventions, you need to develop program logic, program theory. What makes this intervention work? What are the mechanisms? You need to operationalize and measure these mechanisms. You need to develop tools, and you need to develop measures that actually measure whether these tools are being used, like the Kaizen boards. You also need to identify who should change their behaviors, and how can we make them change their behaviors? What are the contexts within which they are likely to change their behaviors? So, for example, do we need a certain level of job satisfaction before we can start our intervention? And if it's not there, how can we develop supportive interventions to increase job satisfaction? Or train people so they become capable of engaging in a participatory process? We need to consider the different types of mechanisms, both content and process. And we need to test CMO configurations, what works for whom, in which circumstances. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to move beyond the randomized controlled trial. I think realist evaluation might be a way forward, but it requires us to rethink how we develop our intervention design, how we theorize about interventions, not just thinking we're going to improve work-life balance, but how are we going to develop and test tools and processes to make employees able to develop work-life balance or improve work-life balance. We need to consider how we measure context mechanisms and effects, and we need to analyze these effects. So that was it.
So thank you very much, Karina. Very interesting talk. We have a few questions here. So the first one is, how did the elephant adapt to the left-hand driving?
Oh dear. Well, we just leave Europe and nobody will ask us to do that.
Now, talking about intelligent questions, the first one, goodbye. The first one is, should participation be seen as a mediator or a moderator variable?
When I have tested it as a mediator because it's kind of what makes the intervention work. But you could expect that there would be not participation itself, but there would be group-related measures that would be moderators, like, for example, having a good team climate. Because if you don't have a good team climate, then people aren't going to participate in the intervention process. So participation for me is a mediator.
Any question from the audience? Otherwise, I keep going with the application. Okay, so the next one. What do you think about individual differences? Personality, values, motivation. Is it an important variable that can affect the result?
Yes, but I have to say I don't use it in my research because I think we go into organizations, we go into existing departments, and there are personality differences, there are differences, and we have to deal with those differences. So the way I go about it is that I try to create processes where it's inclusive enough that there's room for everybody. So those that, are, for example, are very resistant, they have a voice as well, and we just don't ignore them. So that's kind of how I deal with individual differences.
Okay. Any questions? Next one. Can field experiments or intervention really answer theoretical questions?
Oh God, that's a tricky one.
It's a little bit.
Yes, it can, but it depends on the kind of theoretical questions that you're asking. I was doing a presentation in October at Harvard University, and there was one amongst the audience from MIT, and she does work-life balance interventions. And one of her questions to me was, well, what do I do? I go into organizations, and they don't implement my interventions because they have all other things going on. And this didn't make me particularly popular, but my question was, maybe you shouldn't be doing work-life interventions here. Maybe you should be focusing on what their problems are. And I think that it's a different level of theory because it's not our traditional psychological theories. The theories I'm dealing with is what are the theories behind making people change their behaviors. So I think maybe that's, rather than thinking we take a psychological theory and we implement it, maybe we should be looking at taking that theory and then adding the, can we call it process theory or intervention theory in addition to that.
So more related to translate theories into reality.
Yes, yeah. Because I don't think there's anything wrong at all with trying to improve work-life balance, and I think there's good theory of how we can do it, but we also need to consider how can we do that. So it's not just easy to go in and say, do this. You actually need to motivate them to understand why work-life balance is the right type of intervention and why they should do this type of intervention.
Completely sense. Next question. How would you integrate a multi-level approach in testing your model?
Well, how we do multi-level is essentially, I didn't do it in the first studies, but in the later studies we do it. So we essentially look at multi-level in terms of, at the group level, do they have shared participation, for example? There are pros and cons, because the individual's perception of participation might be important, but at the same time, the extent to which we within the group agree on participation, that's likely to influence the outcomes as well. So it's likely to be participation, can you say it's a moderator? But other aspects, multi-level aspects might be a moderator of our individual intervention. And I don't mean individual level intervention, I mean the separate intervention.
Next question. Do you think that real intervention, can real intervention pills also have placebo effects?
Yeah, I get that a lot, and I'm a bit like, bring it on. I mean, there are those that would argue that the participatory process is a placebo effect. But for me, if it's what make the intervention work, I think we should study it and we should understand it and we should make it happen. I'm all in favor of placebo. If it works, it might not be what we traditionally think of as placebo, but it might be a working ingredient that is not within our normal theoretical framework. Does that make sense to whoever asked the questions?
It was anonymous, so I don't know. Any other questions from the audience? So I have a question for thinking on our students, people that are starting to study, make PhD, moving the first steps. What would your recommendations be?
Talk to the organization. That's easy to say. What I would essentially do, when you start your intervention, make a map like this, identify what is my intervention, what are the different elements within the intervention, how do I think I can trigger those, what do I need to do to make the intervention work, and essentially go through, and I'm not necessarily saying that you're using the problem solving cycle, but identify what am I doing in the initiation phase, how can I measure what's happening in the initiation phase, in the screening phase, how am I collecting data on what the problems are within the organization? What do they feel about this way of collecting data? If I do interviews, do they think they're good interviews that capture the right problems? If I use a questionnaire, am I asking about the right things in the questionnaire? So basically do a mapping of what exactly are you doing and how will you know whether one element worked or not worked afterwards. It's very complex, I agree, but it does make life easier, because quite often what you'll see is once you've done your intervention, it didn't work and you have absolutely no idea why. So I'm trying to help you get your PhD at the end of it. So you know what worked and what didn't work.
Okay, well, I would say thank you very much, Karina, for your presentation.
There is a writer that I really like, who is Mario Benedetti, and a quote of Benedetti in Spanish sounds much better, but in English it will be something like, when we have all the answers, all the questions were changed. So this is in somehow how the students are feeling at the end of the Bachelor of Psychology, and as this event is mainly focused for students, what we want is to have some final ideas and take-home messages for, especially for the students who still are here. Not so many, but the best still are in the room. So we are going to ask to all of our presenters to give you one final idea in form of a question, or if it's possible, in the form of answer or advice as they want. So we are not going to give them so much pressure. They can choose what they want, but like a final idea to take you with you, and if it's possible to be relatively clear and to give you a sense of control, it will be even much better, but that will be complicated. So it's up to you.
Well, I'm not sure whether I have a question or an answer, but there's two perhaps issues that I find quite important at the moment. Is we're a bit in the age of fake news, and fake news has got a very political sense lately. We all refer to political phenomena like elections, and well, I don't need to explain to whom I might be referring. But I think that within work and organization psychology, we're also facing a lot of fake news. And it might be due partly to consultants creating some kind of reality that they want to analyze because they have some, how to say, well, it gives them money, I'm afraid. And my question mainly as a scientist would be, and especially to students, is that I would really very much appreciate if we would all be scientists and looking at this kind of fake news. It's so easy to create information by having a small internet survey with one question in which you ask, well, do you feel happy? And then you have this very huge title, Belgians are the most happy ones working in Europe. I've seen this kind of, so we have to be very critical there. That's my message here. We're scientists, we have to look through this kind of message and to really show, well, this is fake science. And it's not that difficult to do that, but it seems like media show it in a different way. We get lots of different messages, and so my message mainly is, let's be critical on that. I'm not sure whether I'm increasing control here, but well.
Thank you. So it's in the media, probably it's fake. It will be the, no, I'm joking. Vicente, for instance.
Okay, thank you. It was a surprise to me that I should give this advice or question or whatever, but in any case, two messages. The first one is, well, if I look back, compared to what I studied when I was in the university as a bachelor student, I mean, now students have many opportunities to learn new things. I think the curricula now are stronger than when I was a student. So it means that now students, you have many opportunities to learn from many different parts of the world, not only because of the internet, but because of this kind of events. So this is amazing. And I would encourage you to adopt a scientist practitioner perspective. I mean, learn from science, try to implement these ideas to practice. In a way, I'm a scientist practitioner because I'm the director of the career service of my university, and I have to manage people. And I can tell you that all these things that we can read in management books, leadership books, team working books, this really works. It's amazing. And you, by doing this, you can improve not only the efficacy of units, but also you can improve people's life. And so by adopting this scientist practitioner perspective, you can have a great impact on people's life. So, and the second message is by adopting this perspective, you can be confident in your own skills. So be brave and change the world. This must make sense.
That'll be easy.
What a beautiful message. Karina, for instance?
Yeah, I'll go with 2 messages as well. And I think, no, because I still got this one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I kept the power here. So I think if you do interventions, remember Murphy's Law. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. And you know, this is why I say collect data so you understand what goes wrong. I'm always like, failed interventions. The only failed intervention for me is if you don't know why your intervention didn't have the intended outcomes. Because even if it doesn't have the intended outcomes, you can still learn from it. And that's you know, if you do interventions, that for me is the most important thing. Learn from the research that you're doing. And I would say, I agree with Vicente, but I also say the other way around. So we as scientists could be a lot better, and that's probably how we could minimize the gap as well, is that if we as scientists start listening to the problems that organizations and practitioners are experiencing, and that's kind of what I'm doing in my research, is that I'm trying to say, okay, so what are the problems that you have? How can we help you solve those problems? Because sometimes we come up with all our fantastic theories, but practitioners and organizations don't recognize them. It's not the problems that they're experiencing. So I think it's actually it's a two-way dialogue. We need both as academics and practitioners and organizations. Cross-fertilization, co-creation.
Yanis, for instance?
First of all, this was a surprise, Alfredo. You told something about the question and answer, but
No, I told yesterday, but
yeah,
maybe
but not
you
at
were
the
in the
end of the
dinner.
session.
Focus on something else.
Okay. I will agree with Hans here that it's really very important to, for example, keep learning, keep questioning. The things that you learn today might not be useful very soon. Much sooner than later, especially compared to how it was when we first studied, and especially in areas like mine where technology has made a real impact. I think a key word that we have always to ask, especially practitioners and consultants, is whether there is enough evidence of what they try to provide to us. I mean, this is a really important key element of what we do in comparison and in collaboration with practitioners. We do research in order to help them acquire the evidence, and they have to use those evidence-based practices that can be useful, really useful, and then they can make an impact. We can make an impact, obviously, as well, but it's mostly practitioners that take our methods, tools, and use them effectively. But we should never, as I said yesterday, as psychologists, we should never forget that there are some basic elements that they always have to be around, a few basic concepts that we should always look for when, especially we interact and make an impact, have an impact to other people.
Thank you. Sabine? No.
I think there are many things that are important, but I now want to focus on one or two things, and I think what is very important is to stay curious. So, and that relates a little bit to also to the fake news argument, is really stay curious, don't stand still, don't accept simple answers. I think that is very, very important to ask questions, to ask why, to ask how, and try to find answers, but don't expect that the answers are always simple, that the answers are always the answers you would like to hear. So, but really to stay curious and to stay interested, and that might also need to develop new methods. So to get the answers, I think that is very important, and not thinking, oh, I studied a lot, I learned a lot, and now I know how the world is and how it functions. Of course, probably you know a lot, but the world develops, and there are always new questions, always new things popping up, and I think it's very important that we all stay curious in order to develop together with our environment.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments from the audience? Then in this case, I would like to thank again our faculty, our dean. Thank you also, Gloria. Thank you everybody for coming. Thanks to the technical service, which made it available also for all the other people interested in the event. Thanks to our guests. It has been really a nice symposium. I personally have learned a lot, so I sincerely thank you. Thanks to Alfredo, who did a big job on this. I think a great effort. And that's it. Go in peace.
It's done. By the way, the students, remember that you have to log in Socrative if you haven't done yet. And it's the same room of yesterday, future work, and then you have to click on the survey, something like that.